আপনারা দেখছেন টকিং পয়েন্ট।
Welcome back. Before we went on break, we were talking about the European Parliament and its various kinds of work and its function and how it helps the citizens. And we go back again to Dr. Charles Tannock, and we ask him about how can the European Parliament help its citizens?
Well, I mean, there are lots of examples. I mean, I occasionally dine in a local Indian restaurant in Brussels, and in fact, it's owned by a Bangladeshi origin man with a British passport who was able to open a restaurant and service the local community amongst the sort of Eurocrats.
When we say Indian restaurant, we say the Indian cuisine.
Indian cuisine. It's called an Indian restaurant, but actually the gentleman is actually an Awami League activist. I met him. He's come all the way from Brussels. I met him when he came over to meet Sheikh Hasina. But there are lots of examples. I mean, for instance, if you go abroad now throughout the European Union and you switch your mobile phone on, the fact that you will not be ripped off, and there's been a cap now on the cost of your phone bill, is down to European Union legislation in which the Parliament had a major say in insisting on having absolute caps on the charges for data as well as voice telephone calls. So that's a practical example. If you happen to be in France and you fall ill, because of the European Union, you get emergency care in all French hospitals for free. If you happen to get on a charter flight going to Spain, if you're a British citizen and you want to go on a holiday and they cancel the flight, you are entitled to compensation. This is a practical example whereby EU laws can actually directly help the citizen. But all sorts of issues which you wouldn't realise, like the quality of the air you breathe in London is affected by EU legislation which regulate the levels of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, all the various pollutants. It is there to try and protect the consumer across the whole of Europe, so that, wherever you live in the European Union, the food you eat, the air you breathe, the water you drink are of a safe, high-level quality for everybody.
There's a joke that you regulate even the size and the color of the banana.
Well, that was a myth, I have to say. The so-called straight banana. There's a lot of Euro myths peddled. There was a regulation on the curvature in terms of the quality of the banana. It never said you couldn't sell the banana which was straighter than the other. It just simply said that when it was classified, certain curves and qualities were given certain classifications, and therefore they were premium quality. But there are myths around, and this country is one of the most Eurosceptic nations, and so I've heard all these stories. Like, for instance, they claimed that you couldn't sell marmalade in second-hand jam jars at village fetes. Again, it was completely untrue. They do, and it's completely untrue. It was a lovely story. A lot of the readers of some of the newspapers, they like to think that it's that it's all true, but actually no. Of course, the European Union often does too much. It can be far too bureaucratic. There's plenty of fat that needs to be cut from the budget. We've had big discussions last week over the budget, and Prime Minister Cameron's been involved with this.
Are we getting a good deal? I mean,
well, I personally would like to see the budget cut in real terms, in nominal terms, but it just isn't possible at the moment because the way the system works, it's just legally not possible to have that, because all the other countries would have to agree to it, and they're not going to, because many of the new countries, Poland for instance, large agricultural sector, gets a lot of aid and handouts from the common agricultural policy. Very difficult to convince these countries that they need to cut the budget in real terms. So what David Cameron as Prime Minister has agreed is a freeze in real terms, i.e. just allowing for inflation at 2%. Now, that's still too much, in my view. In fact, all British Conservative MEPs voted against any budget increase in the European Parliament in Strasbourg last week. But we knew that was really just to send a strong signal that, we don't want any more spending in a climate of austerity. But, ultimately, when there is a new treaty, there has to be an opportunity to look again at things like the common agricultural policy, the structural funds which give, tens of billions to build you know, various things in certain countries. I mean, I think some of them might be good, like building new roads and railway links actually can improve trade between countries. So I don't think all infrastructure projects paid for by the EU are bad. I spent my summer traveling around Spain, and the new motorways there were absolutely magnificent. But of course, Spain is virtually bankrupt as a result because it was mixed funding of Spanish government and EU money.
What is our contribution? How much do we?
Well, you hear different figures about that. We are definitely probably the second biggest net contributor in total, around 6 billion euros. We're only the 8th per capita because obviously we're a big country, 62 million, but actually we're behind countries like Holland and Denmark and what have you. But of course, the total budget of the European Union, which has been all over the press for the last week, you know, whether it can be cut, whether it can be frozen, because of course the other states were asking, the Commission was asking for 5% increase, which is way above inflation, totally unacceptable. That was never going to happen. The total income of the European Union is only 1% of the GDP of EU. It's very, very small. It's about it's very big, obviously, in total because you've got the biggest economies in the world, like France and Germany in there. So it's about 100 billion euros a year, about sort of 70, 80 billion pounds a year, 1 trillion euros over 7 years, which is the multi-annual financial framework. But it isn't actually a large amount of money as a proportion of the entire income. It's just under 1%. But still, I accept that there is a lot of saving to be made. We want to see Europe doing less and doing it better. We want to probably repatriate some of these powers, particularly in the area of employment law, social legislation. Right now, of interest to your listeners, next year, the British government will be repatriating 133 bits of legislation which the Labour government had given as powers to Brussels in the area of justice and home affairs. Things like extradition of criminals, sharing of data across the European Union on criminal activity and those who have been convicted of crimes. And this will be an area where some of the powers can definitely come back to this country and are better done by the British government and the British Parliament.
Talking about budget and economic activity, last week I think it was said that we are out of recession. And you just said that Spain is almost bankruptcy. So do you see something, some silver lining?
I certainly see what we call green shoots. It's early days, you know, the so-called double dip, and I think hopefully the liftoff will stay and prosper, and that the green shoots will take roots in the ground and become flourishing flowers and trees in the next couple of years.
Acorn trees.
You know, many acorns, I hope, will come from this big tree. It's early days, but you know, we did see growth, which was really pleasantly surprising. It's a very tough austerity program that George Osborne's trying to implement. He's about a quarter of a way through it. There's a lot more, sadly, cuts that have to be made in public services. We've raised taxes already. We now have to cut public spending. I say we, the Conservative-led coalition government. I'm not part of that, but I mean, I'm a member of the Conservative Party and an elected representative. So more needs to be done. And it's going to be tough, and there's going to be a rise in unemployment. Funnily enough, the employment figures have been pretty good, actually, all things considered. So something we're doing in this country, we're doing it right.
Over 2 million people are unemployed.
Well, obviously it should be a lot less, and we do need to look at that. And you know, I think that is an issue. There's been a big issue, of course, on the very large number of Eastern European workers who've come to the UK, particularly to London, displacing jobs from the British, you know, workers and all that. So that needs.
But is that a good policy? I mean,
it was a Labour government policy to have open doors, and I think even they've admitted it was wrong. I think it was too early. They should have had a 5 or 7 year derogation, in which, in that period, of course, the Polish economy has grown a lot, and less people would have wanted to leave. When they did it, Poland was much, much poorer, and their currency was very weak. And so there was a big, you know, there was a big incentive to leave these countries. But of course, it's now going into reverse. Some of them are going back and so on. But it did cause a lot of friction and tension and a lot of hostility to the European Union. But that isn't going to happen again. I think, you know, they have learned their lesson. And enlargement of the European Union has really stopped now. There's only one more country likely to join, Croatia, that we can see for the next 10 years.
What about Turkey?
Turkey is a candidate. It is negotiating, but it's very, very slow because it does come under a lot of opposition from countries like France and Germany. This country, all parties here support Turkish membership, but Turkey, of course, has been doing a lot of things internationally in terms of moving more towards the Islamic world, Central Asia, the Turkey.
I mean, its role against the Syrians on its border, but they have problems on the border, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly they've taken a very strong line on Syria. Syria is a tragedy as we speak. I mean, we're now into a kind of stalemate, war of attrition, where neither side can prevail. Turkey has sided with Saudi Arabia against Iran. It had been getting close to Iran, now it's decoupling. It had been historically close to Israel, it's now moved apart. There's a lot of reconfiguration in the Eastern Mediterranean, politically, what's going on. But of course, Syria is very close to Iran. That's seen as a threat to the Gulf states, to Saudi Arabia. And so it's become a proxy war with Saudi and the Gulf states against, with Turkey in alliance against Iran and Syria. And it's tragic for the individuals who are suffering, women and children dying on a daily basis.
We were talking about Southeast Asian workers in the UAE, and they're being denied human rights.
I got involved with a debate. Funny enough, there was a debate last week on this in the European Parliament. This just shows how broad the territory is. We spoke on two areas of interest to your viewers. One was on the UAE, where the government had actually arrested 62 Islamist activists, saying that they were threatening to overthrow the state and the monarchy. But in the debate came on the issue of labour conditions. And actually, in fairness to the UAE, they have ratified conventions now from the ILO to improve labour conditions, and many of them come from Bangladesh and India. The salaries are still much higher in the UAE than anything that can be paid anywhere else in South Asia.
Yeah, but the living conditions are very
Living
poor.
conditions can be very, very poor, and I think we need to keep an eye on that, and that needs to be raised with the UAE government. I had the ambassador in my office. The main concern was more this issue of arresting these individuals on sedition, potential terrorist charges, and in the motion that came out in the end, we've insisted that the government, who are negotiating again a free trade agreement with the European Union for 20 years in this case, we've insisted that they must basically charge these individuals if they can find the evidence, or release them. They can't just lock them up and throw away the key, because they are a sort of, a semi-democracy. They have elections, they do have a parliament, and there's been huge changes in the whole Arab world, the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
And, by and large, it's been a good thing, and we want to see more democracy, more accountability, better human rights in the Arab world. And
they have been helped by the Twitter and internet and
the Facebook generation.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm an old one. I just joined today. I started tweeting today. I resisted it.
Oh, great.
And finally I succumbed, because you cannot be a politician now.
Sure.
Try and keep in touch. I mean, I represent the whole of London, 8 million people. If I want to get my message across to my colleagues and my constituents, what better than Facebook or Twitter? It's fantastic. It's a great. I encourage everybody in the political classes everywhere, even the oldies like me in their 50s, to get stuck in there.
Yeah, there was recently an article, I think, in Huffington Post about the effect of Twitter in Saudi Arabia.
I think it's interesting that it's certainly in Egypt, during the revolution there,
yes,
it was
in
Tahrir Square. There was, people were tweeting and communicating with modern technology, and it's been something which no government can control. Even China, which is repressive, has not been able to stop all the tweeting that's been going on regarding this issue of the billionaire status of the family of Prime Minister Wen. You just cannot control it. This technology is so advanced and diffuse now that no dictatorial regime can actually stop it.
Yes.
So in terms of democracy, this is a very powerful force, and I encourage it.
It's like a monster, if we can use that word, that has gotten out of hand.
You can't control it. You can't control it, and let's harness it for good.
Yes.
Obviously, the internet can have bad things, like horrible things like pornography and organized crime or even terrorism. That needs to be censored and controlled and monitored. But the good things about allowing people the freedom of expression and to protest peacefully, that's something we should encourage.
What best you can do for our country, Bangladesh, as a member of the European Parliament?
Well, I am a strong friend. In fact, I am meeting the Bangladeshi ambassador to the European Union, who's a woman, extremely able lady. In a couple of weeks' time, there's going to be a conference about jute and what can be done with jute. You know, more needs to be made, more knowledge needs to be made available, and more awareness needs to be encouraged with the political classes in this country, United Kingdom, in other member states, that Bangladesh is one of the future rising economic dynamos and powerhouses of South Asia. Huge population. Even in the days of the British Raj, the Bengali culture was always recognized as the highest intellectual and erudite culture in British India. Poets, scholars, even, and of course soldiers as well, fine soldiers. So, you know, there's a lot of admiration going back centuries. But I think in recent years, people haven't known as much about Bangladesh as they have about Pakistan or India or Afghanistan, and Afghanistan for tragic reasons because of the long drawn-out war there. Bangladesh has been slightly forgotten about, and I think it's important that we realize that Bangladesh is a secular democracy in the Islamic world, which is trying very, very hard to pull itself up to become more prosperous.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you, and it's
my
a great
pleasure
honor
too.
that you made
Always a
time
friend of Bangladesh.
for NTV. Thank you
My
very much.
pleasure.